The day my husband died, my daughter-in-law looked me in the eye and said, "Pack your things, the old leech won't stay here." The sentence still burns in me like a hot iron. Richard had just been buried, 38 years of shared life reduced to wilting flowers on a newly closed casket. I believed the greatest pain would be his absence. The empty chair at the head of the table, the silence in the room that once pulsed with his heavy breathing. But no. The real pain came from the cold gaze of his family, those who called themselves children, but who always treated me like a shadow. We were all in the sprawling Westchester house, where every wall held memories I had helped build. My daughter-in-law, Cynthia, was the first to approach. Her heels tapped against the marble like hammers, and her sweet perfume tried to mask the rottenness of the words she carried. "You've done what you had to do, Alberta. Richard is gone. Now this house goes back to his family. His family, as if I hadn't been a part of it, as if 38 years of marriage weren't enough to make me more than just a useless second wife." The stepsons, Michael and James, were quick to join the chorus. "You've always lived off Daddy's money," James spat, holding up a glass of wine as if toasting my expulsion. Michael simply nodded with that cynical smile he'd inherited from his mother. I remained silent. Not out of weakness, but by choice. As they spoke, I remembered the locked safe in Manhattan, the accounts I managed alone, the skyscrapers bearing my name hidden behind discreet companies. The woman they called a parasite was, in fact, the invisible provider of every luxury they flaunted. Cynthia's purse, bought in Paris, my credit card, James's loft in Brooklyn, mortgaged in my name. Even the expensive wine Michael held aloft had been paid for by my stock dividends. When I went upstairs and closed the door, I took only 2 suitcases. The first, with simple clothes. The second, with documents and keys. While Cynthia laughed downstairs, celebrating the family's new phase, I opened the closet's secret drawer and took out an envelope. It was the beginning of my plan. Planned in silence, over years of realizing how much they underestimated my presence. In the dead of night, I left the house. The March wind bit my face, and the distant city lights seemed to beckon me. I got into the black car, waiting for me on the corner. The driver, sent by Robert Miles, my trusted attorney, simply said, "Mrs. Morrison, everything is ready." And it was. While they were dividing up jewelry and furniture, believing they had inherited an empire, I had already set in motion the transfers, reorganized the assets, and set the stage for the reveal. At that moment, I still didn't feel revenge. I only felt clarity. Life had given me the chance to prove that the invisible woman had never been a burden. I had always been the strength that held up every stone of that castle. And soon, they would understand, too late, who Alberta Morrison really was. The next morning, I woke up in the discreet apartment I kept in Manhattan. It was one of those places no one in my family knew about. Light walls, minimalist furniture, a view of the city's pulsating life. It had always been my secret refuge, the place where I could breathe when my Westchester home became suffocating with Cynthia's presence and her poisonous insinuations. As I made coffee in the small kitchen, I felt the silence differently. It wasn't the emptiness of loss, but the sound of freedom. For the first time in decades, I was alone without having to apologize for it. I glanced at the leather briefcase on the desk. Inside were documents no one ever imagined I kept. Deeds to buildings on Park Avenue, dividend reports from funds I'd invested in while still working as an accounting assistant, long before Richard. My financial story didn't begin with him. It simply grew alongside him. I remembered the first building I ever bought over 20 years ago. A derelict Brooklyn property, bought outright when it was still worth a fraction of what it would later be worth. I renovated it, rented it out, reinvested. I did it again and again, quietly. Richard knew. He always respected me for it, even if we didn't tell his family. "Let them think I'm the one providing, Alberta," he'd say. Then we avoid hard feelings. I agreed, because I loved the peace of our life together. But this choice cost me invisibility. To Cynthia and Richard's children, I was just the woman who arrived later. They never saw my calculations, my sleepless nights monitoring the market, my discreet visits to construction sites. They didn't know that every aspect of their flaunted lifestyle was anchored in my silent work. That day, Robert Miles called me early. "Alberta, we've already organized everything. The transfers are complete, the properties are consolidated into the trust in your name. They have no idea what awaits them." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. My mind was already a few steps ahead. This wasn't just about money. This was about dignity. I didn't want the Morrisons to love me out of obligation. I wanted them to know, once and for all, who I really was. Late in the afternoon, I sat by the window and watched the city light up in thousands of points of light. Each illuminated building seemed to remind me of something, that no matter how much they try to erase you, the truth always finds a way to shine. Meanwhile, in Westchester, Cynthia was probably popping champagne bottles, believing she'd inherited a life of luxury. The sweet taste of the wine would soon turn bitter. And I, the parasite, was the one holding the reins of every penny. That night, I wrote in my diary, "They cast me out like a burden. They will soon discover that they have always lived off the weight I silently carried. I don't just want justice. I want them to feel the vertigo of losing everything, while also realizing that it was my hand that sustained them." I smiled to myself. It wasn't blind revenge. It was just the truth, naked, indestructible, about to reveal itself. While I spent my days in Manhattan, reorganizing files and confirming transfers, the scene in Westchester was different. From the news that reached me discreetly, and also from the conversations Robert, my lawyer, picked up behind the scenes, Cynthia and my stepchildren behaved like vultures at a carcass. In the main room of the house, where the scent of funeral flowers still lingered, they opened drawers, shared dishes, and even fought over who would get the most expensive wines in the cellar. Cynthia, always with that air of victory, gave orders. "James, this table is perfect for our new apartment. Michael, take the paintings, and I, of course, will take the family jewels." None of them realized the ridiculousness of the scene. None of them asked if they were entitled to anything beyond what their hands could reach. To them, I was already out of the game, and the inheritance was ready to be savored. What they didn't know was that Richard had already made a choice years earlier. When his children began living on appearances and debt, and Cynthia showed more interest in showing off than caring, he silently signed the transfer of all his assets into my name. "Alberta," he once said, "I want to make sure that what we've built together doesn't go to waste." I remember the night we stored the documents in a bank vault in Midtown. He took my tired hand and smiled. "One day they'll understand." Now that day was approaching. As they debated whether to sell the house or keep it as a family mansion, Cynthia made a point of quoting me in a dismissive tone. "That old woman wouldn't have a place to fall dead without Richard. I bet she's living on a pension now." James laughed, toasting with the remaining wine. "May she have her old age. The good life is ours." Michael simply added, "The lawyer should be reading the will soon. I can't wait to see her face when she gets crumbs." Little did they know that when the envelope was opened before the judge, it wouldn't be crumbs that would remain, but ashes. That night, in my apartment, I opened a bottle of wine alone. The dry flavor ran down my throat like a silent toast. They celebrated the illusion of an empire, and I celebrated patience, the most underrated gift of an invisible woman. I took a deep breath, closed my eyes, and told myself, let them keep fooling themselves. The further they fall, the louder the sound. The day of the will reading arrived like a whirlwind. The Westchester County Courthouse was cold, lit by white lamps that had nothing cozy about them. I sat at the head table, dressed simply in mourning, a black dress, my hair tied in a low bun, while Cynthia and my stepchildren entered as if they were about to attend a party. Cynthia wore a bright red dress, as if she wanted to announce victory before it even began. Michael straightened his expensive suit, bought on credit, and James didn't put his phone down, smiling as if already making plans to spend what he believed was his. The lawyer solemnly opened the file. "Last will and testament of Richard Morrison," he began to read, his firm voice echoing throughout the room. Silence fell immediately. The first few lines were predictable. Mention of the funeral, formal words of farewell. Cynthia leaned back in her chair impatiently, drumming her fingers. But then came the line that changed everything. I declare that, as already registered with a notary and duly transferred during my lifetime, all assets, real estate, investments, and accounts are in the name of my wife, Alberta Morrison. To my sons, Michael and James, I leave the symbolic sum of $50,000 each as a token of remembrance. To my daughter-in-law, Cynthia, I leave only the request that she take care of her own life, for I can give her nothing more. The room erupted in murmurs. Michael's eyes widened, his mouth open as if he'd swallowed rocks. James leaned forward, slamming his hand on the table. "This is absurd," he shouted. "He wouldn't do this to us." Cynthia jumped to her feet, her face red with rage. "That woman manipulated him." She pointed at me with a trembling finger. "She must have faked the whole thing." I remained still, taking a deep breath. The lawyer continued, unperturbed. "I confirm that all transfers were made in full knowledge, years before my death. My trust and love have always been in Alberta, who cared for me and our assets with dedication." James threw his phone against the wall. Michael shook his head, repeating, "No, no, no," like a useless mantra. Cynthia tried to argue with the judge, but her voice sounded increasingly hysterical. I, silent, just watched them. There was no pleasure in seeing them stripped of their arrogance. There was justice. Truth finally stood like a solid edifice, while their illusions crumbled to dust. When the reading was over, I slowly got up, gathered my bag, and simply said, "The house you're in is mine. You have until the end of the week to leave." The silence fell like a final blow, and for the first time, I realized my invisibility had been broken. They no longer saw me as a shadow. They saw me as what I had always been, the real Mrs. Morrison. The following days were a parade of despair. Cynthia and my stepchildren, who until then had behaved like heirs to an empire, now scurried about like rats trapped on a sinking ship. The morning after the reading, I received 3 calls from different numbers. First, from Michael. "Alberta, we need to talk. Maybe there's been a misunderstanding. You know, Dad always wanted us to be united." His voice trembled, trying to sound conciliatory, but underneath it was pure panic. Then, "James, this won't stand. I'll challenge you. I'll expose you." He screamed so loudly he could barely articulate. "Finally, Cynthia." Ah, Cynthia. With that sweet tone she always used when she wanted something. "Alberta, my dear, we're both women who have suffered. We don't need to be enemies. Think about Theo. Think about the family. We can work through this together." I hung up on every call without answering. Silence was my weapon. While they were consumed with phone calls and internal discussions, I walked around the house in Westchester, my house. Every hallway, every painting, every detail now breathed differently. Where before I felt like a tolerated visitor, now I walked as its owner. The key in my pocket weighed not like metal, but like justice. In Richard's room, I sat on the edge of the bed and took a deep breath. He had foreseen everything. I knew the children would be lost to greed and that Cynthia would never accept me. So he gave me not only the goods, but the strength to take what was mine. On Friday, the deadline I gave them expired. I returned to the house with Robert. I found Cynthia in the lobby, surrounded by suitcases. She tried to maintain her dignity, but her eyes betrayed defeat. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice firm but broken inside. "No," I replied, looking her directly in the eyes. "The mistake was believing I was invisible." James walked past me carrying boxes, cursing under his breath. Michael followed close behind, avoiding my eyes. With each step they took, I felt years of contempt being swept away. When the door finally closed behind the family, silence filled the house. But this time, it wasn't the silence of exclusion. It was the silence of victory. I walked to the window and saw the garden lit by the late afternoon. For the first time in decades, I didn't have to shrug my shoulders to fit in the space. The house, the possessions, the future, everything was finally in my hands. I, Alberta Morrison, the parasite, the useless second wife, was now the sole legitimate heir. Not out of revenge alone, but because I had always been the invisible guardian of what they never knew how to value. And in that moment, I realized my life didn't begin at Richard's funeral, but now in the silence after their expulsion, a silence that gave me back my voice. The next morning, I walked through the house as if discovering it for the first time. The sun streamed in through the large living room windows, reflecting off the pale walls and illuminating furniture that had previously seemed cold. For the first time in decades, there were no hostile footsteps behind me. No hurried voices reminding me that I was just the second wife. There was only silence, but now a fertile silence. I made coffee in the kitchen, alone. I sat at the long table, the same one where I'd been ignored so often, and there I ate my breakfast with the serenity of someone who didn't need to ask permission to exist. Each sip was an affirmation. I was finally home. Later, I went to Manhattan to meet Robert Miles. His office, filled with mahogany bookshelves and the smell of old paper, seemed like the ideal setting for closing chapters. He handed me a folder with all the updated documents, properties, trusts, and accounts consolidated in my name. Alberta, there are no loopholes now. You are solely responsible for the estate, he said. What you do from here is your decision. I ran my fingers over the pages like someone caressing a map. It wasn't just money. It was freedom. It was a voice. It was a new life. I returned to Westchester at dusk. I walked to the garden, the same one Cynthia called her party scene, and sat on the iron bench next to the roses I had planted years before. They were in full bloom, red as embers, alive, despite being forgotten. I smiled. We were alike, those flowers and I. Underappreciated, but resilient. That night, I lay alone in the wide bed. The pillow still held Richard's scent, and tears escaped me. I missed him, his low laugh, the way he called me my partner. But along with the longing was one certainty. I was honoring what he had left me. Not just his possessions, but his trust. I looked around the room and thought of everything that lay ahead. Trips I'd never taken because I cared for his family. Projects I'd postponed so as not to disturb him. The life that could still flourish at 64, unchained. Now it's my turn, I whispered to the ceiling, before turning off the light. And for the first time since the funeral, I fell asleep without feeling heavy. Life, after all, hadn't ended with Richard's death. On the contrary, it began there, in the skin of a woman who, after being discarded, discovered she was free. The following weeks became an exercise in rediscovery. For the first time in years, I woke up without the sound of other people's voices vying for spaces that never belonged to them. I walked around the house in Westchester and felt every wall breathe with me, not against me. It was as if the mansion had finally chosen its rightful owner. I began rearranging the rooms, the guest room, which Cynthia had dismissively called the mother-in-law's room. I transformed into a library, the shelves filled with books I'd stored in boxes, waiting for the day someone would let me exist. Richard's old office became my command center, screens displaying charts, investment reports, and new venture plans. I, who had always been behind the numbers, now occupied the front seat. Visible, undeniable. I began traveling discreetly. I went to New York to visit the buildings I had purchased years before, each one standing as a pillar of independence. I walked through the marble lobby of a Park Avenue skyscraper, and the security guards greeted me by name. For the first time, I didn't have to hide who I was. Alberta Morrison, owner. Alberta Morrison, investor. Alberta Morrison, no one else ignored. Upon returning, I sat down with Robert to discuss plans. I want to create an educational fund, I told him, for young women who, like me, have been treated as invisible. I want them to learn to invest, to build, to never depend on anyone's approval. He smiled proudly. This will be a legacy far greater than any inheritance. And I knew it was true. My revenge had already been accomplished when Cynthia and my stepchildren left the house with their heads bowed. Now, what I was building was something beyond victory. It was permanence. That evening, in the garden, I lit small lanterns along the path to the iron bench. The red roses glowed in the soft light. I thought of Richard. "You gave me the chance to bloom, even though you weren't here to see it," I murmured. "But wherever you are, know this. The promise you made to me is fulfilled with every step I take." As the summer wind rustled the leaves, I felt a different kind of peace. Not the peace of resignation, but the peace of conquest. I was no longer the invisible widow. I was a free, powerful woman, master of a future that only I could write. At the end of summer, I sat alone on the terrace of my Westchester home. The sky was tinged with orange and purple, and the distant city seemed like an embroidery of lights stitched across the horizon. The silence that had once weighed me down was now music, the melody of freedom. I looked around, the library full, the office filled with my projects, the garden blooming like never before. Every corner of the house bore my mark, no longer as a shadow, but as a presence. I had taken back not only what was rightfully mine, but also what had been denied me: recognition. Cynthia, Michael, and James vanished from my daily life like dust swept away in the wind. I heard rumors that they fought among themselves, blaming each other for the loss. But it no longer mattered. What they never understood was that true wealth wasn't just in millions of dollars, but in the strength to be underestimated and still prevail. I closed my eyes and remembered Richard's voice. One day, they will understand. Yes, they understood, but too late. And I was finally free to be who I'd always been. I rested my hands on the railing and let the wind ruffle my gray hair. I smiled, not with the satisfaction of revenge, but with the serenity of someone who survived invisibility and transformed it into power. Then he said in a low voice, as if speaking to all the women who have ever been discarded, "They called me useless. But I was, and always will be, the invisible root that held up their entire castle. And now, this castle is mine alone." And when the sun sank completely behind the horizon, I knew it wasn't just the end of a battle. It was the beginning of the life I always deserved. The following months were a process of rebirth. Each morning I rose early, made my own coffee, and walked through the garden as if each step carved a new identity into the ground. I was no longer the second wife his family ridiculed. I was Alberta Morrison, $47 million woman, investor, strategist, and free woman. I began receiving invitations to business events in New York, many of which I had already attended in silence, hiding under the title of Richard's wife. This time, I entered with my own name. People looked at me differently, and not just because of the wealth I represented. There was something in my posture, a firmness that came from someone who no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. One such evening, as I toasted younger women who surrounded me with questions, I felt a sense of pride. Many of them were where I once was, invisible, underappreciated, trapped in marriages where they were nothing more than shadows. I told them a bit of my story, not about inheritance, but about discipline, patience, and investment. I saw in their eyes the same fire that once burned in mine. Returning to Westchester after those nights was like returning to my temple. The mansion no longer felt cold, but alive. The hallways, once filled with hostile voices, now echoed only my footsteps, steady, unafraid. I began decorating the rooms my way, choosing furniture that reflected my essence. Every detail was a statement. I exist, I command, I remain. One afternoon, I sat in the newly tidied library and wrote a letter, not to Cynthia or my stepchildren, but to myself. In it, I recorded the woman I had been, the invisible, the humiliated, the discarded, and the woman I had become. I folded the paper and tucked it away in a book as a reminder for the future. Never again would I allow anyone to reduce my worth to silence. Life has shown me that justice doesn't always come through the law, but through the awakening of those who learn to see themselves. And I saw myself. For the first time in a long time, I saw myself whole. Autumn arrived in Westchester, painting the trees gold and red. I walked through the garden at dusk, listening to the dry sound of leaves under my feet. With each step, I felt the weight of the years melt away. as if I could finally breathe without the burden of justifying myself. In the library, I turned on the lamp and opened the journal where I'd recorded my journey. The pages were filled with notes, financial strategies, memories with Richard, hidden tears, but also silent victories. I leafed through each line with gratitude. Not for having conquered his family, that was in the past, but for having conquered myself, the shrunken version I once accepted as being. That night, I sat on the terrace. The city shimmered in the distance, and the cold wind touched my face. I thought of Cynthia, Michael, and James. There was no more hatred. They had dug their own abyss by underestimating me, and I had simply taken the place that had always been mine. I closed my eyes and smiled. My life now was not about revenge, but about freedom. I held in my hands not only fortunes and real estate, but the right to exist fully. And I left one last reflection engraved in my heart, not just for myself, but for all the women who once felt invisible. Never underestimate a silent woman, because when she decides to speak, it's not just her voice that rises, it's an entire empire. The wind blew stronger, as if carrying my words beyond the walls. And I knew, this wasn't just the conclusion of my story. It was the beginning of the legacy I would choose to leave. If my story touched you, subscribe to the channel to hear other voices that, like mine, have risen from silence. Like the video so more people can hear stories of courage, and let me know in the comments which city you're watching from. I want to see how far this message of strength and justice can reach.